Hi, Peter Ko from MLEX. I just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about what role you see for biofuels.
Biofuels is interesting. In the 2007-8 price spike, a lot of the media were saying it's all because of biofuels. Analysis doesn't really support that. But I think we've got to think rather seriously about how we actually deal with the transport sector. In the simplest way, deciding to turn maize into ethanol rather than actually using it as an agricultural product for either direct consumption or for livestock consumption quite clearly has an effect on the supply of the food for livestock. But I think that the issue is more complex. We have got to be thinking about biofuels which are actually climate smart and in fact food smart, because I think the potential for second and third generation biofuels to actually use waste products from the agricultural industries is really quite substantial, and a lot of work is going into that, both in across the other side of the Atlantic, in Europe, in the UK as well. And I think that the potential to actually have processes that will break down cellulose and turn waste products into essentially starches and sugars that can then be used for fuel is really quite important. I think that there is clearly some practices that seem fundamentally inappropriate. For example, cutting tropical rainforest in order to produce biofuels does not seem to me to be a particularly sensible thing to be doing, because why are you producing biofuels? You're producing them because you want to actually address some climate change issues. But I think there's a fundamental concern, which is as the oil price is going up, that there is going to be a relationship between the price of oil and the price of agricultural products which actually could be turned into biofuels. And I think that if you do the econometric analysis, there does seem to be a very close link between the proportion of, for example, maize in the USA that is actually switching into ethanol production and oil price. And I think those links we will have to expect to become more exacerbated, particularly as the oil price is going up. If you actually ask a producer of maize, do you want to sell it for cattle production or for feeding other types of livestock, or at this price, or do you want to sell it into ethanol production at this price, they will go quite appropriately and quite sensibly for the latter, which means that the input prices of agricultural products into particularly livestock production are going to increase, and we'll see the sort of knock-on effects of food inflation. The oil price and the price for biofuels is intimately related, and that will continue to be the case even as you move to second and third generation biofuels, because waste will start to become an important commodity.
Andrzej Gosowski, expert from Poland. One question and one common question related to the Doha issue. Could you explain, Professor, how the countries in Europe with about 200 days of growing period could compete with the countries with 365 days of growing period? And the comment related to the biodiversity. In Eastern Europe, you have quite richer biodiversity than in Western Europe, so we are really open to offer, let's say, several packs of wolves or the bears to the forest if you have around London. Thank you.
First of all, in terms of complementarity, of course there is an issue about the length of growing season, but particularly if you actually look at the predictions about what climate change is likely to bring over the next 2 decades, and remember that irrespective of what is actually going to be happening at an international level on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the climate that we're going to see over the next 2 decades is determined by the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at the moment. Now, projections indicate that, in fact, there will be some degree of favouring, particularly in terms of rainfall and temperature, in terms of production in Northern Europe. Yes, you're shaking your head, and of course climate change issues are problematic. But the issue is that there are the potential for complementarity. There's also issues of transport costs. I'm not a trade expert on this area, but I think that we have got to be pondering about how particular interventions in the international trading system can be beneficial or to the detriment of particular aspects of our communities. And I think the analysis that the group have done, and I'd refer you to that particular analysis in terms of asking about what happens if there are trade restrictions and what happens to prices in different parts of the world. And we used teams of economic modelers from around from different parts of the world, and they all came up with much the same consistent picture, indicate that there is a potential problem, and a potential problem for Europe. In terms of biodiversity, enormously difficult issue in terms of both internally and externally. Do we wish to have, and in a sense, there's always going to be a trade-off between yield and biodiversity. There may be some win-wins, but they will not be there in general. I wouldn't seek to comment, for example, on the CAP. It would seem to me that the questions that one wants to ask about any reform of the CAP is, do they go in the direction of addressing these issues of the food security, water security and biodiversity security? Do they go in the right direction? The detail is complex and really is for policymakers and those involved in a direct way.
Shelby Matthews, European Farmers and Cooperatives. What we're looking at for farmers is to find ways of encouraging them to produce in a more sustainable way, but not to the detriment of their production and their productivity. And the problem is that we're always getting measures put forward which are beneficial for the environment, but do have this damaging, well, they either restrict production or reduce production, or they reduce profitability through productivity increases. You had a very good example with Climate Smart. I wondered if you, climate smart agriculture, I wondered if you had any other examples that we could use to encourage, to get this balance between the two objectives. Thank you.
Yeah, we can all think practices that are not sensible. For example, I think there's a real concern in the way that agricultural products are regulated in Europe. And I think the basis of regulation, which is based on hazard, rather than a proper risk assessment, which has been increasingly the practice over the last few years, does seem to me to be significantly problematic. I'm particularly worried about, for example, fungicides, where there is the concern that, yes, they are endocrine disruptors, certain fungicides, but that in fact, if they're banned under a hazard basis, because they're endocrine disruptors, as opposed to what is a true risk assessment of the degree of that disruption that can be caused by their normal practice, you could be looking at some of the yields of some of our cereals dropping by 20 or 30%. So this is enormously difficult. I believe in dialogue. For example, I do believe that if there are concerns, for example, about GM crops, there is no doubt that there is a large community in Europe, less so in the rest of the world, I have to say, that are concerned about GM crops. I think we need to bring out what are the true concerns. Are there genuine scientific concerns? Can they be addressed? Can they be looked at? And can one move forward in terms of some rational discussion of these issues? And I think that's the way forward. For example, in the United Kingdom, we have climate skeptics. But I think the key thing there is to actually discuss them. Bring out the details of the science where there are concerns, and see whether in fact it is possible to reach some degree of overall consensus. And I think the danger that I see quite often in the discussions of these issues in the media is that you have an overall consensus of views of the scientific or analyst community pointing one way, and 2 or 3 dissenting voices. And they are seen by the media as almost like a football match, equal. And that I think is profoundly mistaken. And I have written and got myself into some fairly serious hate mail by making this point rather long and on occasionally rather strongly. So these are complex issues, but my way I believe is the way forward is to actually get rational, pull out the essence, because it's perfectly reasonable. If we think about 10 or 12 years ago when GM crops were first being introduced, what's the benefit and what's the potential risk? Nobody had much of an idea of how one could do a proper risk analysis. 12 years on, the concerns about GM crops as being a threat to human health, well, I have yet to see a case of litigation about human health effects of GM crops, even in North America, where litigation is not exactly unknown.
Dawn Howard, National Farmers Union from the UK. Thank you very much for raising the issue of extension services. And I'd just like to hear your views on how, on a national and international basis, the development and sort of future funding for extension services can be taken forward so that producers are able to benefit from both existing and future new developing technologies.
Well, I think as you and your colleagues in the NFU know, I've been saying that I think that we should try to revive mechanisms of extending extension services, certainly within the UK. And I think it's recognised more widely that this is actually quite a good and efficient way of actually increasing agricultural productivity by having these extension services. In terms of funding for it, I'm going to escape and say I'm the chief scientific advisor. I'm not the financial advisor. I think I think the key role for me is to say, look, this is a smart way of doing it. We have let our extension services decline. It's interesting, for example, that if you look at extension services in parts of Africa, there are more people working in extension services in certain areas of Africa than there are in the United Kingdom.
Stephen Maisel, I'm President of the British Chamber of Commerce and also a Director of Science Business. I'm referring to the graph you showed, which showed the degree of waste in different parts of the world and where it comes from.
Yeah.
In the US, the UK, and in Western Europe, where you showed, I think, 30% of waste coming from once it's actually been purchased by the consumer.
Yep.
That is presumably cultural, and I wondered if you had any suggestions, polite ones perhaps, on how that perhaps could be dealt with.
Culture change is a tough one. But I think culture change does occur. Who would have ever predicted that smoking would have been banned in public places 15 years ago in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in Europe? Unimaginable. There has been a culture change. And so culture change is not impossible. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, that there are real problems. But I think there are some things that manufacturers can do. I think in terms of the retailers, and obviously there are discussions with retailers, you know, the 2-for-1 offer is an obvious target when essentially you have small households who say, well, I might as well buy 2, it's the same price as 1, but I only need 1. You know, those are things that actually can be directed, and that's a thing for the retailers. I think there's also issues to do with thinking about how one can actually have a prolonged life, a rather longer life of particular products, which is actually quite possible. And I think there are a number of small interventions, but I think the key thing is to get the headline up there, to actually pose the question, what is waste costing? And there's an interesting report that I've just seen, which is jointly authored by an organisation I wasn't familiar with, but the Worldwide Fund for Nature, which is pointing out the cost in terms of wasted water of actual food waste, which is enormous. And I think that one of the areas that we need to be pondering about is to say, can we do something smart with our food waste? Rather than bagging it up, putting it in landfill, are there smarter things we can do? Manifestly there are, and on farms we're seeing those ways. So there's lots of ways of addressing it, but I think a culture change of saying you should be embarrassed to throw away food is that culture change, just as now people are embarrassed to smoke in a public place. And I think also, with certain noble exceptions, people are now embarrassed to drive when they've had too much alcohol. And I think that's been a big culture change, certainly since when I was about 18 years of age. But I think those are the ways we see those changes occurring. But it's a good question.
Nick Jacobs, I'm a journalist with Agri-Europe. I had a question about the role of scientists in politics.
Sure.
There has been discussion about having a chief scientist at EU level. During your speech, you said that these issues, taking decisions on CAP reform, is really something for the policymakers. Do you see a complementary role for an EU chief scientist in that process, or do you think it would cause more problems than it would resolve?
I wrote an article shortly after the election of President Obama, in which, with that article, I compared and contrasted the scientific advice that Obama was getting and that President Barroso was getting. And Obama appointed John Holdren, who is my equivalent, who's actually a nuclear physicist by background. But he also appointed Stephen Chu as his Secretary of Energy, a Nobel laureate. There's the Council on Science and Technology that advises Obama, 2 further Nobel Prize winners and about 20 eminent scientists. There is nothing like that in Europe, but Europe has those similar problems in which the best scientific advice is going to be essential on all sorts of issues. And so I think it would be definitely advantageous in all areas of policy to have the best scientific advice. That doesn't mean that the scientific advice dominates, because obviously there will be financial, economic, legal and indeed political considerations. But not having that, and not having that scientific advice at the centre of decision making, seems to me to be missing. Now the President in his, I suppose it's towards the end of 2009 now, indicated that it was his intention to appoint a chief scientific advisor, and I very much look forward to that appointment. And just to give you a feeling of how these things operate, when we were dealing with the Japanese nuclear incident in Fukushima, I was able to talk to John Holdren in the White House and discuss analyses that we had done in the UK about the implications, compare and contrast with that. That is an enormous advantage to actually have at the international community, and I think that the European Commission would, with merit, go forward and appoint a chief scientific advisor. I think it would be enormously helpful both to the Commission itself, to the community, and I think to international cooperation on science.
Sir John, you started your presentation with water scarcity. Is desalinating seawater a potential source for irrigation water? Should we produce more of that?
Very interesting question, and in fact I think that it depends where you are in the world. It depends on the cost, because desalination is actually costly in terms of energy, but there's certainly the potential for significant desalination in some parts of the world. For example, and you need to be thinking about ratios of coastline to the landmass. So for example, India is arguably perfectly designed for some degree of desalination using solar energy. Desalination is going to have to be an issue. It may be, I think it's going to be particular for particular parts of the world, and I think that one of the areas that I think desalination is going to be needed is particularly in those areas of the world which don't have very substantial sunshine and where aquifers are being significantly overexploited. So there are some very major aquifers in the northwest of India, in Saudi Arabia, for example, and actually in the southern USA, where the aquifers are being significantly overexploited. That is possibly in areas where some desalination, but it takes a lot of energy to desalinate seawater, and it also takes a lot of energy to move water around. So these are difficult questions, and there will be no general answer. It will be particular to the individual situation, but obviously an issue. The other area that is interesting, of course, is that using our understanding of plant genomics, a lot of the scientific community in the world is actually working towards producing strains of particular plants that are actually going to be able to live in saline conditions and in drought conditions. And I think there's real potential for that plant breeding to actually improve the situation where you are actually getting in coastal margins some problems of saline infestation into the agricultural land.
Sir John, I'd like to follow up. I was going to ask the Chief Scientist question. I'm Phil Newton from European Crop Protection Association, but I'd like to drill down a little more about science. Very often we see in politics, it's not just the media that have an odd and frivolous way of dealing with science, but in the political realm, very often the political calculation is done before the science, the quality science is in. And we can see that very much the case in Europe, where there is a very deep and developing mistrust of science and pronouncements about risks and balancing risks. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about how to increase the trust in science and develop a better understanding of quality science in a political frame.
Yeah, I think this is a real, it's one of the issues that is right at the front of my agenda, because I think there's sort of, if you like, there's faults on both sides. I think the scientific community has on occasion claimed a certainty when it wasn't there. I think that that has brought a degree of distrust. I think less so now. I think that also the scientific community has been reticent to take on pseudoscience or inadequate science, science by assertion, if you will. And I think that scientists aren't normally combative, except with other scientists. So so there has been a tendency not to actually seriously address nonsensical statements. I coined the phrase saloon bar skepticism, which means that the character who is sat in the bar drinking a large whiskey looks out of the window and it's snowing and says climate change, global warming, it's nonsense. And I'm afraid quite often those sorts of scientific, nonsensical saloon bar science are used as somehow being of equal merit and equal weight to what is an enormous global consensus. Now there is a problem because, in a sense, the world of science grows by skepticism, it grows by criticism, it grows by saying, one scientist says, that analysis you did is complete rubbish for the following reasons, and this is why. And science moves on by that criticism. It's the way that science has grown in the past. It's the way we move from believing that the Earth was the centre of the universe to realising that that the Earth moved around the sun, and then actually, as we move on, that the sun is a very minor entity in a very minor galaxy in a billion galaxies. That's the way that skepticism of science grows. So people like to be skeptical, and properly so, but I think also there's a role for what you might call consensus. There are a few Newtons, there are a few Einsteins, there are a few Schrödingers or Cricks and Watsons who actually fundamentally change the way that the scientific world. The vast majority of scientists work in a community where by and large there is a consensus about things. You will get changes, and sometimes that consensus is undermined, but it's undermined and it's usually a pretty good approximation. It's not that something is fundamentally wrong and we got it all wrong. It is that actually we thought about something that was slightly deeper and that you explain the regularities that come from that scientific consensus. So I think that I've written recently and said there's a scope for skepticism, manifestly so, that's the way science grows, but we should be impatient of nonsensical skepticism or ill-founded it. And we should actually ask about the evidence base. We should ask about what is the evidence behind a particular policy, irrespective of where that origin, whether that comes from an NGO or whether it comes from a government or a commission like the one we have here. What is the evidence? And let's examine that evidence in an appropriate and rational way. And I think that's the way for the future. We're not nearly there yet.
Peter Weber, DSM Nutritional Products, Switzerland. I've got a question which is related to your challenge, hunger. The other day, I read a report from the CDC in the United States. They're actually saying that food security in the US was increasing over the last couple of years from 11% of the population to 14%. So actually, I'm wondering, because a large part of the report is really on Asia, Africa, and so on, what do you think about food security in, say, in the Western world, like Europe and North America? Because I could imagine once it comes to hidden hunger, that could be quite an issue.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think the first point to say is that in the developed world, it's about price, really. It is in the developing world, but more so. And I think that the poorest in our community are the ones that actually suffer from price inflation on food more than others. And I think that there is a real issue in terms of hidden malnutrition that you're actually seeing, particularly in the developed world, where prices are starting to go up, and that the poorer parts of the community are actually not having highly nutritious food, and you're seeing a feedback into inadequate both physical and mental development. And I think that one of the sort of really extraordinary things that as a young man, I noticed, I come from the country, and I'm not a particularly tall person, but when I went first as a student to London, I was startled how small people were. And it's to do with the fact that most of that generation had been brought up during the Second World War. There had been significant problems of rationing in the United Kingdom, and you just saw that. And you can see that that has changed now. And so I think that we have got to recognise that these are issues, and that there is an issue for food security in the developed world as well. And that is, but it is so clearly related to price, but it's also related to education. We do need to be thinking about what are sensible diets. I think there are issues to do with what sort of food we feed children in schools, what sort of food is available, and what is arguably fashionable. But again, it's the question of culture change, and that is really very difficult. But certainly, ignoring food security in the developed world is not sensible, because there is a problem.
Kaert, Nestle. Your report is impressive in the sense that it develops a lot of points, and I think all of them merit, in fact, to go into more depth. But what is also impressive is actually that all those drivers are interacting with each other. What type of policy recommendations are you proposing to come up with a type of holistic approach?
I think the first thing is to, well, thank you for your kind remarks about the report, but I think the first thing to do is to recognise that these are intimately linked. You're not going to solve food security if you ignore climate change or water security or energy. You're not going to solve an issue of, for example, biodiversity loss if you ignore the issues of food security and climate change. So I think that, first of all, it's the recognition that these things are intimately related. I think it's then the recognition that we've got to move in some stages through both national, intergovernmental and international fora to make these points. So for example, I think it is quite extraordinary that agriculture has never figured in any large way in the discussions about climate change. And I think that this is a way forward. I think we need to be thinking about policies which actually relate agriculture, water, energy and climate change at the international level. And it's not easy. You know, the basic structure of government and indeed organisations like the European Community and the Commission, there are silos, there are divisions. This is climate change, that's our business. You know, agriculture, keep out. That is to caricature it. But there are definitely issues. In the United Kingdom, we have a Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and we have a Department of Energy and Climate Change. Now, of course, they talk to each other. There's a chief scientist in both departments, and they meet with me every Wednesday. And so, you know, we have a breakfast meeting for all chief scientists in the United Kingdom every Wednesday morning. And so there is some joined up feeling. But it is problematic because there are these issues. But I think the key thing is recognising that they are intimately related, and then asking the question, yes, but if you're coming forward with a policy on one area, how does that affect what are the implications in the other area? I think that's the only way, and it's small change, but I think recognising the problem is the first step.
Thank you. Ray Schonfeld, Single Market Ventures. Could I ask you to broaden your comments in answer to the question about the EU chief scientist? I'd like to ask, we're in the situation that we are in today in Europe. Given that we've got that situation where Barroso has announced an intention, but we haven't moved down that road, how do you evaluate our ability at the European level to build a consensus and to drive forward the sort of ideas that you are putting forward here at the global level? And in terms of your own time, are you better off spending your time in Brussels or going straight to Washington? Now, it'd be a bit too easy, I think, for you to respond, well, of course, we have to do both. How do you evaluate our ability to drive forward at the European level discussion of this sort of issue?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I have no reason whatsoever to believe that there will not be a chief scientist appointed in due course by the president. And you know, all my discussions with officials and commissioners to date have that there is an expectation. So, you know, that is the first thing to say. In terms of evaluating how scientific advice operates within Europe compared with how it operates in the UK. And in the USA, I think that there are enormous numbers of select committees which provide advice on particular issues to the within the European community. You know, they're everywhere. But I think that the issue is really that their agenda is set. The questions they're posed is set within policy, rather than actually having a free rein to actually set some of the agendas. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have something of the order of 60 or 70 science advisory committees. I meet with the chairs of those advisory committees 2 or 3 times a year, and they have the opportunity to, in a sense, they of course answer questions that are posed to them by by the individual departments and the secretaries of state of these departments, but they also have the opportunity to say, we believe this question is important, we should address it. And I think I would contrast that with, and not all, generalizations of that sort are very difficult, and obviously one would point to differences, but that would be the mood music, I would say, is that you get more challenge, as it were, from saying these are important questions than you do here. In the USA, something rather similar. I think the difference between the USA and the UK is political, because the appointment of a chief scientific advisor in the USA goes with the presidency. So Obama appointed John Holdren. After the election in May, I was previously reporting to Gordon Brown. I'm now reporting to David Cameron because I'm a civil servant, and there's strengths and weaknesses on both sides of it, but that is a fundamental difference. How that will operate in the appointment of a chief scientific advisor to the presidency here, I just don't know. But that is the difference. It's interesting, if you look at the community, the only other country in the community that actually has a chief scientific advisor is Ireland. So it's Ireland and the United Kingdom are the only two that actually has that. In the world, it is quite different. For example, Japan has a chief scientific advisor. If one looks to other countries, there are chief scientific advisors. For example, in Australia has one. There is something similar role in Korea, and so on. So I think that there are different models. But I think the key thing is in the UK, I feel that we have improved in the sense that it's not just me. Because if you ask about a chief scientific advisor in the modern world of science and engineering, it's a fundamentally absurd job. How can an individual operate at all these different levels, everything from, GM crops through nuclear energy, through pandemic influenza, and taking in odd things like volcanoes and producing ash over Western Europe. But what we've got in the UK, which I believe is unique, is that every major department of state actually has a chief scientific advisor. So some of them are engineers, some of them are natural scientists, some of them are actual social scientists, some are economists. But each one has a sort of a chief advisor. And as I say, every Wednesday we have a breakfast meeting for those chief scientific advisors, and we obviously meet regularly. That helps us to advise on that general level. But that's probably a step too far at the moment. I would be delighted to see the President appoint a chief scientific advisor, and would look forward to meeting him.
Thank you, James Eade from Kellogg's. I've just got one request and a question. In terms of following up on your last slide, as the food industry as a whole, we are very much looking at these issues. They are very much on our agenda, to reassure you. I think the key request I would have is harmonisation, and if you can, at any opportunity, impress that, particularly within different countries, member states, in terms of developing such matrix methodologies, etc. My question is, there's been a lot of talk about science research this morning, and one of the comments you made was the huge lack of investment in R&D over the years, and matching that potentially with yield gaps, etc., etc. Do you see much appetite in your travels for more investment in agriculture, in food R&D, than what we currently have now? And do you see that actually going forward, or there's a lot of support but not a lot of action, should we say?
As Dominic said in his opening remarks, the G20 discussions that President Sarkozy will be chairing have put food security right up on the agenda. The President of the World Bank has made speeches indicating that he believes food security is the most important issue to be faced in 2011. I would agree with that, but I'd also add a few more years after 2011. I think in terms of the actual fundamental research, I certainly in North America, where I have spent some time, certainly I believe food security is way up on the agenda, and there's much more investment in R&D addressing it. Within the UK alone, our BBSRC, which is our Biological Research Council, has got a £100 million sterling programme on food security. And in fact, when I leave this meeting, I'm going to go to a meeting that has been called jointly by the Joint Research Centre, and Dominic Ristori and I will be sort of chairing and taking that meeting, meeting in which the whole issue of how research within Europe is actually going to be addressing these food security issues. So I think there's an appetite. I think it's quite difficult because there's time lags. Now, I think we are getting very, very good people wanting to go into areas of science which actually are relevant to food security. 10 years ago, it was a dead end. So we will have a time delay as essentially the aging of the scientific community comes through. But I think there's an appetite, and I think there's certainly an appetite also in the commercial organisations. You know, if you talk to some of the major agribusiness operators, they think that way, and also indeed in the retailers. There is a lot of research going into that. And your own company, I believe, is also taking investment, particularly, for example, in waste management, very, very much more seriously than perhaps they might have done 10 years ago.
My name is Ben Blevins. I'm with European landowners, and I was wondering how subsidies might either help or hurt in the agriculture sector to achieve the goals that you've put forth.
Yeah. I don't think I think it's very difficult to say all subsidies are bad, all subsidies are good. I think it depends what they are, and I think what we need to be thinking about is, I suppose I'd probably move it out from subsidies to incentives. I think government intervention and regulation can actually have a lot of effect on changing policies which would not happen in a normal during the normal economic situation, and some degree of market failure. I think if we look at it in gross ways, there are some serious issues in terms of world trade, and that it would be possible to be thinking about in the developing world a more prosperous agriculture which would feed in through to all issues to do with food security and hunger and poverty, and a more prosperous agriculture in the developing world would help everyone. To the extent that competition from the developed world is undermining that, and that competition is coming and is subsidized, I think all the analysis in this report points to that as being unattractive. On the other hand, if you're thinking about incentives, for example, to improve biodiversity, ecosystem services within particular communities, those seem to me to be incentives that are perfectly legitimate because they're outside the market and they are the domain of the community rather than the individual landowner.
In terms of science and what science could deliver, what is your imagination of how intensive agriculture could reflect an increase in yield in a sustainable way? What's the sort of theoretical limit, for example, for wheat?
I think in terms of wheat, what's typically, productive, an average productivity, something in highly efficient areas of something of 10 tonnes a hectare, something of that order. In sub-Saharan Africa, about 3, 2, 1 in some areas. So I think certainly we'll have an expectation of significant increases just in terms of using current technology in Africa. In terms of what would be the limits, I think it depends in terms of in terms of plant bleeding limits and the very, very best strains operating the very best environment, one could be looking to something of the order of 18 tonnes per hectare as being feasible without total changing of the system. That's the sort of analysis that I think was published as one of the driver reviews by our colleagues there, some from the BBSRC. But that's the high-tech end. There's an awful lot to do with common sense approaches, low tech, addressing the problems. There is a role for technology, but that role of high levels of biotechnology, we've got to recognise that what's developed now won't be coming into place for at least 10 years. Now, there's marvellous developments that are actually happening in the world of plant genomics. For example, the University of Dundee has just done a complete DNA sequencing of the potato. Never been done before. The ability to sequence DNA and the cost of it is dropping the whole time, the speed of it. So I think we're seeing it. We don't have a full wheat genome yet. God's plan for the universe. Why is the wheat genome more complicated than the human by a factor of 5? I don't know. But I think we will get full sequence of the wheat genome, and I think it's the way of actually utilising these breakthroughs that will occur in the basic science, but turning them into a technology that works is really where I think the importance is. And that's why I'm delighted to come to a meeting like this. The questions were extraordinarily challenging, I should say, and I've enjoyed it very much. So I much appreciate you coming, and thank you for your attention.